In the reading corner today, I'm really thrilled to be welcoming Chella Quint, whose new book, Own Your Period, will be published by Quarto in September 21. The reason I'm so excited to be welcoming Chella is because, thinking back to my own teen years, there was nothing like this book available. And as I was consulting with her prior to our recording, I mentioned that we even referred to periods as your curse. Nothing could be further from Chella's approach to dealing with this subject. And so I'd really love to welcome her this morning.
Hello.
So Chella, to get us going, I wonder if we could first of all delve a little bit into your background, because I understand that this was the subject of your university research. Now, when did you start thinking about periods needing attention? And second to that, what was the basis for your research?
I had terrible fears about periods from my first period until I was in my 20s. But I woke up one morning and didn't know when my period was due and realized I should start tracking my cycle. And then thought I should make this elaborate cycle chart. I thought for my whole life, for the rest of my monovulatory span, I will create a chart per year. I'll turn it into a lovely little book or a zine or something, and maybe I could share it with people. And I decided my half-term project that year would be to, just for myself, to make a little fanzine all about periods that was a cycle chart. I decided it would be a 10-year cycle chart, and that way I'd always have it. And so I started putting this together. I interviewed my mom, I interviewed my sister, I put a call out for lots of stories, and then I finished the zine. But then more replies kept coming in, and I realized I might need to do a second issue. So over my summer holidays, I wrote, I'm allergic to gin. I've always said that because I'm allergic to gin, I'm allergic to juniper. I don't, go, for a drink after work. So I had to find another activity that, would take the edge off. And I decided for me, it was stand-up comedy. So in my holidays, I would do kind of nerdy open mic nights and sort of punk rock science themed comedy club nights and things. And I sort of incorporated this ad hoc period research into this performance. And so I created a fanzine called Adventures in Menstruating. And I discovered this archive of vintage ads up till the 50s that were for all different types of products, but the menstrual product ads were I was just absolutely struck by the sexism, the language use, the really obvious hard sell persuasion that periods were terrible, leaking was terrible, showing your products at all was the worst thing ever, and that these companies could save you, not just save you from embarrassment, but they used language like horror and secrecy and fear. And that language sort of echoed up through the ages into the kind of period talk that I had when I was at school. Mm. And I wanted to do something about it. Meanwhile, at my school, they were starting to develop a new curriculum model that would allow for distinct PSHE lessons with a PSHE team. And they asked me if I wanted to be on it, and I did. And eventually I ended up becoming the head of PSHE. So all of this sort of coalesced into one day me actually sort of saying to my head teacher, by the way, I do this comedy show about periods. Is that okay with you? And they were delighted. The whole senior leadership team just thought this was fantastic. And they had no problem with me bringing it into school as part of my master's research. I was doing a part-time master's on literacy, and I started to focus my dissertation on menstrual literacy and menstruation education. So for my preparatory work, I interviewed primary school teachers on how they delivered the period talk. And their experiences were really similar to mine. Only the girls got the talk. Usually a visitor came in or a very nervous teacher came in. And I started asking them about, was the person that taught you confident and knowledgeable? And I realized that if the way you learned about periods was from someone who didn't seem confident or didn't seem knowledgeable, it almost didn't matter what your first period experience was like or whether you had periods at all. The way that you could be sort of imbued with a sort of good foundation in menstrual confidence was whether anyone seemed confident when they told you and whether you could trust what they said. And because of this comedy stuff I was doing, I was sort of starting to feel more enlightened about it. And I had this period horror story myself when I was a kid. I was at a slumber party. There was a blizzard. I talk about it in the book, but it didn't end well. So it took me a really long time to get over it. But what helped was using comedy, making up silly songs, getting the audience to do arts and crafts with me at my shows. And I wanted to see if that would work with pupils. And I thought if I could create some lesson plans and sort of a learning lab with a class of students, we could take this back to other teachers, let them try it, see if it worked for them. And it worked. I became a member of the Society for Menstrual Cycle Research. And I was actually their keynote speaker before I even started doing my own research, because I performed for them. And that's how I sort of fell in with this menstrual research community, which was wonderfully supportive for doing my master's.
I have to say that this really underpins what this book does. Humour is a serious thing. It allows us to talk about serious things and get deeper, probably, than if we were too serious about it. But it's also incredibly knowledgeable. And the fact that you went off and did, further research and are obviously still researching, I mean, that's what comes through in this book, Own Your Period, as well. It is so well informed. Let's go on to the book, Chella. Tell us a bit about its Own Your Period. And you've left nothing out, as far as I can see anyway. You've certainly covered areas that I didn't know anything about. So tell us something about the structure of the book and some of the themes that come through that you think are particularly important and perhaps haven't been dealt with before.
I first wanted to reassure kids that anyone could read this book, that it might be directed at period owners, but if someone else happened to pick it up who didn't have periods and wasn't ever going to, they should definitely feel they could read it too. And I also wanted to include little stories about my sort of errors growing up. Like anytime I had a little epiphany or got something terribly wrong or was worried about something, I wanted to share not just what the problem was, but also how I eventually solved it or had helped to solve it. Because I wanted kids to have a peer as well, sort of talking to them about it. So there are very, very much elements of 12-year-old me chatting to them throughout the book. But also, I thought some really silly things. And I thought they'd really appreciate hearing about it. Like I didn't know what blood clots were in your period. And, they look like bits of jelly. And I was terrified at first. Because to me, it sort of looked like a liver. I couldn't think of any bodily organ that it could possibly be. And I decided my liver must be falling out. And I was really panicked. But we managed to turn that into a little doodle that the illustrator, Giovanna Medeiros, did a great job at, of a liver organ, sort of a cartoon liver, just sort of leaving with a little suitcase. And I think it was important to me to include things like that throughout. But it was also important to me to include little bits throughout of things you could do. So there are activity suggestions throughout the book as well that are just sort of peppered about, particularly the later on you get in the book, things you can do at home, things you can do at the shops, like, do a visual survey of all the products available, interviewing like an older relative about their experience and attitude toward periods, and even like things you could do if you wanted to lead a class activity yourself or ask your teacher to. That sort of comes as the book goes on. But it was important to me to start the book with the absolute basics, naming external genitalia, explaining the internal organs, talking about hormones and how hormones and glands work, the phases of the menstrual cycle, the absolute bare minimum stuff that you should learn maybe in science or in any period book, but sort of done in my style. And that there were sort of extra bits that were like food for thought, like mentioning that a uterus is actually a lot smaller than you think, definitely smaller than any diagram would show it. And then we go on to how to manage periods. So a lot of schools focus on just how to use a pad or tampon or what they look like or how to ask for one or where to get one. But they don't really talk about the other aspects of managing periods, which are sort of, charting your cycle so that you know when your periods due, learning to notice signs of ovulation just for yourself, not because you are concerned about your fertility right then, but just so you know that you have a cycle that lasts longer than just the week of your period. And also managing periods includes looking after your general health and diet and exercise and sleep, talking to people if you think there's a problem, and learning how to talk to people. And then the other aspect of managing periods is taking responsibility for your choices. So knowing that if you choose disposable menstrual products, there's a cost and an environmental implication. If you use reusable products, there are some benefits to that around, sustainability, but also comfort. So finding out of as much as you can was sort of what that middle section is about. And that all is under the umbrella of managing. And then the third section is about period positivity, which is a phrase I coined when I first started this project. So like 2005, I wrote my first fanzine. 2006, when I was sort of touring it, I was saying this is a period positive workshop. And it was sort of meant to follow the lines of body positive and sex positive, but it's meant to be inclusive. So, like all genders can talk about periods. Any ability, is suited to talking about managing menstruation and the finer points of it. And it's also, it's not corporate. Period positivity is about reclaiming the language and practice of talking about menstruation from the advertisers that have sort of dominated the discourse for so long because people were so embarrassed.
One of the things that I really loved in the book is, as well as the period and the menstrual cycle, you deal with the much bigger reproductive cycle as well. And I loved the notion that you are there in your grandmother's womb, that you took it to that level. And then right at the other end, this discussion about the whole transition of menopause. So there's a big picture here as well.
And it's literally a big picture. You sort of see this timeline over two spreads of the book where you do go from the idea of being an egg right up until the menopause transition and defining perimenopause and menopause and postmenopause. Like one thing that I didn't realize before I wrote the book was that menopause is just the moment periods stop, and perimenopause is all the symptoms. So people don't realize how long they're in perimenopause, or that it starts earlier than the day your periods stop, and the symptoms can continue afterward as hormones change and your body system sort of recalibrate. But the way it's defined, I just thought kids would find that interesting. But for any kids whose parents or teachers are going through the menopause, it was super important for me to include that because this is a part of their universe. So it wasn't just about preparing them for what's coming, in 30 or 40 years' time, but also about explaining to them where they fit in this whole process. So I think a lot of period books and a lot of, school education leaflets sort of make puberty this hard start of, this is your period. Like menarche is, the word menarche makes me laugh because it always sounds like anarchy to me, and that's sort of how puberty is presented. Like, you don't know when it's coming and you don't know what it'll be like, but everything's going to be really horrible for a little while. And the menopause is presented that way too. You don't know when it's coming. You don't know what it'll be like, but it's going to be horrible for a while. And there's nothing you can do about it. When that's not true at all. There's loads you can do, but because of stigma, people don't talk to their doctors necessarily. And that's true for kids. A lot of school absences, it was discovered in a piece of research done in Bolton in 2010 by a GP's trust, that a lot of school absences were down to kids having menstrual issues that weren't necessarily medical problems. They were more down to worries and fears that kids weren't actually sure how to deal with. And the recommendation was to teach about menstruation better so that kids would know how to talk about it with a doctor or a parent when there was a cause for concern or a potential medical issue, but also how to deal with, the aches and pains and fears and worries, and just knowing what periods feel like and what's normal and what isn't for them, so that they would feel more comfortable coming to school and addressing it in school. But it was essential for me that readers realize that they have been going through a growing up process already for a really long time, and they're already really good at it. I think at every opportunity to throw in a little bit more information, I managed to get permission from the editors to squeeze some in, because I know that those kids that I worked with wanted to know everything. And I don't doubt that other kids would too. And I felt like all of it was left out when I was a kid. When I was an adult, every experience I had that had to do with menstruation or fertility or menopause, like anything I read in an article, any interaction I had with anybody older than me, my mind was completely blown. And I was just like, why didn't I learn about this? Or I can't believe I didn't know this. Or I was 2 years old when I found that out. And I don't want kids to have that experience. So I just managed to squeeze everything in. And I think the final section on period positivity was the most important to me because that was the results of the research. And so starting with the advertising history and the taboos and the myths and busting those and helping kids see where any negativity came from, like from, older generations and where it might be sort of still lingering in them was important for helping them subvert it. Mm-hmm. And then the final bit of the book is, how to talk about periods, how to navigate talking about periods at school, how to do arts and crafts and like craftivism to reclaim menstrual fear. And then it actually ends with the period positive pledge, which was the final output of the research, sort of what schools and other organizations should do to make sure that their work is fact-checked, inclusive, cite sources, is, continually updated to be accurate, and just is generally savvy to the fact that we are behind on this and we need to improve rapidly. So the period positive pledge adult version exists on my website, but the kid version is only a sentence or two for each pledge. And the editorial team helped me convert it into kid-friendly language. And that's now up in schools. And I'm so excited that doing this book helped me to be able to share that message, which was originally for the adults, with the kids themselves.
Yeah. I mean, I'd like to come to that actually and talk a little bit more about the Period Positive Awards and what schools can do to make this a good experience for young people, because they're two sides of the same coin. You need to get them both right, don't you?
Absolutely. I always say that everyone from the head teacher and chair of governors to the canteen staff and like the lollipop lady should be able to answer a kid's question about periods if it comes up. Because if they need to know something in that moment, or even if it just occurs to them, that's a teachable moment. And if you are shocked or act disgusted or put them off, it's like what happens when you put off a question about sex. It might not be the most opportune moment, but it can give the impression that that's not a topic that they're allowed to talk about or a thing that's bad. And it sort of adds to the stigma of periods by sort of saying, we don't talk about that here, or, ask your parents, or I'm not going to talk about that in public, or, anything like that. So what I say for schools is you should do a basic period catch-up session with everyone. Like I call it menstruation 101, everything you should have learned at school, but probably didn't, because that way everyone's on the same page. But talking about the advertising and thinking about your own experience and your own memories. So, like I often show kids and younger teachers the looped pad and belt that people used, like sort of, from the 50s up till the 80s, because people can't believe it when they see it. They consider it like a contraption, but actually it was both reusable and disposable. So it was a little bit more eco-friendly than most of the stuff that people grew up with nowadays. And I show them all reusable menstrual products. I have people try on like an example loop pad and belt over their jeans, and they always find it hysterical. But it's important to sort of show the history of how these products developed, but also it's important to talk to people about how we used reusable products up until 100 years ago. This is a new invention and it's still evolving. It has no business sort of infiltrating the way we talk about our bodies and our health. There shouldn't be such a focus on discretion and hiding leaks, because hiding leaks is what makes staff and students so fearful about periods at school. And the best way to deal with that is to talk about why it happened and stop repeating the patterns that have embedded that fear in our culture. Mm-hmm. And it's true in every culture. Every culture has over time either celebrated periods or been afraid of periods. Like nobody can decide. And it's really important to remember that, kids and parents coming from outside the UK have also got the same issues as people in the UK. Like I work with a colleague in Kenya as part of the wider Period Positive Global Network, who was also annoyed that their government had a lot of influence from Procter & Gamble when looking at period poverty. And so does ours. They have no business running the period poverty scheme or even co-running it, because that's again, like, influencing pupils. Menstrual product companies want to sell menstrual products. I want my kids to learn. When I was head of PSHE, I made really sure that they knew that some products came from companies that were more and less ethical, that some products you could make at home. And I started developing a lesson with a textiles teacher on how to make cloth pads and how period pants are made, because these are really useful products. Period pants are like a really great innovation. And they're like the first innovation in menstrual product design in decades. And they're so valuable because they're easy to use. They are, easy to wash, and they make managing menstruation a lot less complicated than it was when I was learning about it. But most adults you talk to have never heard of them, or are not sure how to try them out, or which brands, work, or what to look for. And so what I wanted to do was teach teachers how to teach kids how to manage these kinds of questions and investigations themselves. I also want schools to feel that they can keep learning and keep developing stuff and share it. So I've developed a program of study for schools about periods that's on my website, but I've also vetted it with lots of other teachers and medical colleagues. And it was even presented at the APPG on Women's Health in Parliament in 2018. But it needs populating. And I know there are teachers already doing great stuff. And I know there are parents coming up with really lovely ways to talk to their kids about periods. And that stuff could be some lovely lessons that, in my sort of vision of the near future, we're doing curriculum jams where teachers that want to participate come along or, join online and create a lesson that meets some of the standards in the curriculum model that I developed that looks just like any other, national curriculum guide. Because of all the taboos, we didn't have, a menstruation education history. It was either, passed on between parent and child, or, passed on in communities, or kind of shared by, like, I guess from like the 40s onward, a visitor who would come in, divide the boys and the girls, give you the leaflets and free samples and leave. So now if we're rewriting it, it's, we do have to plonk down a new curriculum from scratch. We've got to create it. So I am looking for help from people to create it. But one thing that's been going really nicely about the Period Positive Schools and Places Awards is that so many people already get it. They realize they're already meeting a lot of the criteria based on what they do. And there are only a few things they need to tweak or think about, like kids being allowed to go to the toilet during lessons, like all staff having a basic level of knowledge that they can share, like getting reusable products as well as disposables for the free periods program. All of these details can't just happen in a day, but they can happen a lot quicker than you think.
I completely concur with that. And can we just mention that the website is periodpositive.com, and that should be a point of call for anybody that wants to find out more. Can they contact you via that website?
They can, yeah. There's a contact form. And I should also mention that I have just brought out an adult book about periods. It's called Be Period Positive. And because of publishing deadlines and COVID delays and the Suez Canal and furlough, it's actually been written later, but coming out sooner than Own Your Period. But it's 100 questions and answers about everything from menarche to menopause and beyond. It's a really great primer for teachers and parents who are about to have the period talk or are planning lessons with their pupils or their kids. And I really hope people enjoy it.
They're really good companion pieces. People can also follow you on Period Positive, at Period Positive on Twitter. And period_positive on Instagram. Thank you, Chella, for joining me today in the Reading Corner. Who would have known there would be so much to talk about? And even so, I know that we've only scratched the surface. People are just going to have to get Own Your Period to find out more. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. It's lovely.
In the Reading Corner is presented by Nikki Gamble and produced by Alison Hughes. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please do leave a review for us. To find out about other projects, including an audience with events and the Exploring Children's Literature Summer School, visit www.exploringchildrensliterature.uk. Join us again soon in the Reading Corner on your favourite podcast platform.